Record numbers of patients spent more than 4 hours waiting in A&E units in England in December. And figures leaked to the BBC suggest January's figures could be even worse, which would make it the worst performing month for 13 years. We'll ask our health editor what the figures mean for patients. Also this lunchtime, anger at the government's decision to close a scheme which allows unaccompanied children into the UK, refugees. Don't block Brexit, the warning to the House of Lords after the government's bill gets strong backing in the Commons. It may be grim, but don't complain. The new law, which critics say doesn't protect tenants from rogue landlords. The Australian man who survived spending hours struggling to keep his nose above water after his excavator rolled into a waterhole.
And here in the south, one case every hour now. A dedicated centre for victims of FGM opens in Berkshire. And Bournemouth's chairman defends the club's lack of activity in the January transfer window.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Record numbers of patients spent more than 4 hours in accident and emergency units in England in December. That's according to the official figures. And according to data leaked to the BBC, January is set to be even worse. Those figures suggest record numbers of people waited longer than 12 hours for a hospital bed once seen in A&E, making January the worst performing month for A&E departments in the past 13 years. The government says the vast majority of patients were seen and treated quickly, and busy periods in hospitals were supported by an extra £400 million of funding. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes reports.
I've got lorazepam ready.
For months now, accident and emergency departments across England have been struggling. Last week, the BBC was given exclusive access to the Royal Blackburn Hospital, where the pressure on A&E was plain to see.
We need beds and staff. It's just like banging your head against a brick wall.
I feel as though I'm going to collapse if I don't get laid down.
You need a bed.
Definitely.
It's distressing. It's really distressing for people.
Queuing for 5 hours in the corridor. It's not what you expect for a country like ours, is it really?
We need to get some blood from you.
More patients and a shortage of beds mean longer waits. And official figures from NHS England published this morning show that December was the worst month on record for waiting times in A&E.
The pressure this winter is greater than it's ever been. It has been a steep climb this year, but the thing that has changed the most has been not the 2 or 3% increase in demand, but it's the 40% increase in the delays in moving patients, helping them get back to their homes and back into the community.
Now new, provisional data for January leaked to the BBC suggests that picture has got even worse. This data appears to show that last month just 82% of patients were transferred, admitted or discharged within 4 hours, the worst performance since the target of 95% was introduced in 2004. 780 patients waited for more than 12 hours for a bed after being admitted to hospital, again the worst figures on record. And more than 60,000 patients faced a wait of between 4 and 12 hours, more than in any month since 2004. The NHS in Scotland is coping better, but performances in Wales and Northern Ireland are even worse than England, symptoms of the pressures building right across the health and social care system.
Demand is increasing. We don't have the resources to match it. But even worse than that, many of these figures reflect patients who are not coming in with something relatively minor but needing sorting out and then going home again. It reflects the experience of people who are coming in needing acute hospital admission. And every patient stacked in on a trolley in a corridor, not getting to the ward they need to be on, not getting the treatment they need, is, for us, any of us, an individual system failure.
Mind the needle here.
NHS sources acknowledge the system is facing unprecedented demand. And these latest figures suggest there is little sign of a respite. Dominic Hughes, BBC News.
Our health editor Hugh Pym is with me now. These figures are for England, but as Dominic was suggesting there, there's a pressure across the UK.
Well, that's right, Simon. I mean, just to look at those figures in a little more detail, as we heard there, the number of patients in December in England treated or assessed in A&E within 4 hours was 86.2%. That is the worst since records began in 2004. Scotland in December was a little bit higher, quite a bit higher, 92.6%. Wales down at 81%. Northern Ireland just below 70%. So the same pressures everywhere, though different bits of the UK reacting in slightly different ways. Let me quote you another stat. There were nearly 500,000 emergency admissions to hospitals in England in December, another record high. And that's what NHS England are pointing to. The sheer volume of patients coming through is above anything that has been seen before, and they think staff are working incredibly hard and coping very well in the circumstances. But for patients, as we've been hearing, there are more and more waiting longer than 4 hours on trolleys after a decision's been made to admit them to hospital, but to find them a bed more than 4 hours. And I think, as we've been hearing throughout this week on BBC News, some really difficult stories in hospitals about what's happening to patients, what they're going through, and how frustrated staff are. And this is just December's figures. As the leak to the BBC suggests, the figures for January, provisional, are even worse. And of course, winter is still not through.
Hugh, thank you very much. And as Hugh said, we'll be going to be looking at the state of health services in the UK all this week for the BBC's NHS Health Check. You can follow the coverage online too at bbc.co.uk/health. The Home Secretary has defended a decision which means that a key route into the UK for children caught up in Europe's migrant crisis is to close after a total of 350 arrivals. The government says it will stop receiving children via the so-called Dubs Amendment at the end of March. Lord Dubs, who aimed to help thousands of children get to the UK, called the decision shameful. A legal challenge to the decision will go ahead tomorrow. Dan Johnson reports.
They may not make as many headlines, but these children of Europe's migrant crisis haven't gone away. Refugees are still on the move, still searching for a new home, and around 90,000 of them are youngsters with no family. Under pressure for the UK to do more, David Cameron promised to bring some of them here.
Refugees are welcome here.
Campaigners were hopeful 3,000 would benefit, but the government's announced the scheme will end, having rehomed 350. That's angered some, including MPs.
They are heading back to Calais, back to Dunkirk, back to the mud, back to the danger, back into the arms of the people traffickers and the smugglers, the exploitation, the abuse, the prostitution rings, and back into the modern slavery that this Parliament and this government has pledged to end.
We have a different approach to where those most vulnerable are. We believe that they are in the region. That's why we've made a pledge to accept 3,000 children from the region, and we are committed to delivering on that.
Well, I'm a refugee, and I came to England at the age of 6.
Lord Dubs, the Labour peer who designed the programme. Having been rescued from Nazi Germany, he knows what it means to be a refugee.
I'm very, very disappointed. I was in Greece about a month ago. Desperate the conditions in the refugee camps there. A lot of children there, some of them unaccompanied children, bitterly cold, miserable. We owe it to those children.
The first young refugees arrived last October. 200 have been rehomed so far. Another 150 will come before the end of next month. News that more won't be following them has been described as a betrayal of vulnerable children like these and of British values. The Home Secretary said there was a risk of encouraging people traffickers. She's restated the government's commitment to other schemes, bringing thousands of refugees to the UK, directly from camps in the Middle East. Dan Johnson, BBC News.
Well, let's speak to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. And Norman, just how much anger is there over this?
Well, I think genuine anger, Simon, because it is such an emotive issue. That said, I do not detect any sign of a government rethink. In fact, the Home Secretary almost seemed to be revelling in her defiance and bullish approach, chiding critics for basically adopting a high-handed approach and a high moral tone. She said Britain could be proud of its record. We had fulfilled our obligations. And in terms of the details, well, her argument was that many local authorities simply didn't have the places to take in more refugees. The French authorities weren't enthusiastic about the scheme. And if we continued with it, the danger is that that would simply encourage the people traffickers to bring more children into Europe. All of which said, I have to say, I think many MPs are genuinely scratching their heads as to why the government has decided to wrap up this scheme, because It's only been running for 6 months, and these sort of schemes take a bit of time to bed down for local authorities to get the appropriate procedures in place. It's also only taken in, 350 children, which is much less than many had expected. And I think there's also a view about the sort of image, the message it sends out about Britain, particularly in a post-Brexit world when we want to demonstrate that we are open and welcoming and confident and tolerant. So, I mean, is it done deal? Well, you know, perhaps not. I think much will depend on how the public react, how the media react, and there is also going to be a legal challenge. So this might not be quite over yet.
Norman, thank you very much. Downing Street has played down suggestions that the House of Lords could be abolished if it doesn't back legislation triggering the Brexit process. A government source had warned it would face an overwhelming public call to be abolished if it tried to oppose the bill passed by MPs last night. Our political correspondent Carol Walker reports.
The ayes to the right, 494. The noes to the left, 122.
A resounding victory for the government as MPs voted overwhelmingly for it to begin the formal Brexit negotiations. Scottish National MPs struck a defiant note, singing the EU anthem Ode to Joy. But the bill now passes unscathed to the Lords. Downing Street has played down an earlier suggestion there could be calls for the abolition of the Lords if peers try to frustrate the legislation. But they are facing some tough warnings.
The message of the British people was clear and unambiguous. They want to leave the EU and they want us to get on with it. If the Lords, who are unelected, try and subvert or distort the outcome of that referendum, I think that will put them in constitutionally a very difficult place.
But ministers accept that the Lords do have a role to play, and opposition peers have said they will try to make changes to the bill.
We've always been absolutely clear from the Labour group in the House of Lords. We're not going to block, we're not going to wreck, but what we're not going to do is be intimidated into not debating and looking at it in the normal way as we always do every other bill.
Last night's vote exposed the deep divisions in the Labour Party. More than 50 Labour MPs defied their leader's instructions and voted against the bill. Jeremy Corbyn now has to find replacements for 4 shadow cabinet ministers who've resigned and decide what, if any, action to take against more than a dozen more junior shadow ministers who also rebelled. The Labour leader dismissed suggestions the issue had caused another crisis for his leadership.
Yes, there is a difference of opinion about that from MPs who represent strongly Remain constituencies, felt they should represent their constituents. I understand that. However, it was a national referendum, the national decision and the national result.
Theresa May's been meeting the Italian Prime Minister Paolo Gentiloni. She's hoping to get Parliament's approval to start formal Brexit negotiations with EU leaders by the end of March. Then the tough talking will really begin. Carol Walker, BBC News, Westminster.
The US Senate has backed one of President Trump's most controversial cabinet nominees, Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General. More than 30 years ago, Mr. Sessions has denied a post as a federal judge when he was accused of racism, allegations he has always denied. He will now take charge of the Justice Department and more than 100,000 employees, including 93 US attorneys. Our correspondent Richard Lister sent this report.
Democrats, civil liberties groups and those representing African Americans reacted with outrage when President Trump nominated Senator Jeff Sessions to take charge of the Department of Justice. Senator Sessions has always denied allegations of racism from his time as the senior lawyer in the state of Alabama. But during his judicial confirmation hearing in 1986, he described the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People as anti-American. He also admitted describing landmark legislation ensuring that black people could vote as intrusive. He's since said it was necessary and he supports it. Democrats also criticised his long-established backing of Mr. Trump, saying the government's chief legal officer needed to be an independent voice. After the vote, he reached out to them.
I appreciate the full debate that we've had. I want to thank those who, after it all, found sufficient confidence in me to cast their vote to confirm me as the next Attorney General of the United States of America.
But Democrats are not convinced. In a blistering Twitter attack, Senator Elizabeth Warren said if Jeff Sessions makes even the tiniest attempt to bring his racism, sexism and bigotry into the Justice Department, he'll hear from all of us. And you better believe every senator who voted to put Jeff Sessions' radical hatred into the Justice Department will hear from all of us too. Another of President Trump's nominees made some outspoken comments of his own last night. Judge Neil Gorsuch, the president's pick for the Supreme Court, was apparently unhappy with Mr. Trump's criticism of the judge who suspended his travel ban, expressing his displeasure to a Democratic senator.
He certainly expressed to me that he is disheartened by the demoralizing and abhorrent comments made by President Trump about the judiciary.
That may win Judge Gorsuch some Democratic support as they prepare for his confirmation process. But that, too, will be a tough battle as Democrats do all they can to obstruct Mr. Trump's agenda.
Well, let's speak to Richard in Washington now. We know Donald Trump is angry about this. How else but through Twitter?
Yes, indeed, Simon. I mean, this is a potential embarrassment for Donald Trump to be criticised by his own nominee, and Mr. Trump is not, it seems, a man who takes well to embarrassment. So his strategy, it seems, is to blame the messenger, and the messenger in this case is the Democrat Senator Richard Blumenthal, who made those comments from Neil Gorsuch public, saying that he found the Donald Trump's criticism of another judge disheartening and demoralising. Well, in the past few minutes, President Trump has tweeted Senator Richard Blumenthal, who never fought in Vietnam when he said for years he had, major lie, now represents what Judge Gorsuch told him, ? Well, there are two claims here. The first is about Senator Blumenthal's Vietnam record. He did serve in the US Marine Corps during the Vietnam era, and he didn't serve in Vietnam, but on a few occasions he did give the impression that he had, something for which he apologised. But the much bigger question is whether he misrepresented what Neil Gorsuch said. And Neil Gorsuch's confirmation team very quickly came out and said, yes, actually those comments were accurate. Now, President Trump must know that, but clearly he wants to avoid that battle. Much easier to blame the Democrat. And in any event, he had an important victory last night with the confirmation of Jeff Sessions after a really divisive battle on the Senate floor. Jeff Sessions is somebody who was a very early supporter of Donald Trump, is in lockstep with him in terms of many of his policies, and he will now be sworn in as Attorney General later today. Simon? Richard, thank you very much. Well, all that as the new director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, arrives in Turkey for his first foreign trip since taking office. Let's speak to our correspondent Mark Lowen, who's in Istanbul. He's got to hit the road running. There's a lot on the agenda.
There is a lot on the agenda, Simon, and top of the agenda will be Syria and the fight against so-called Islamic State. Turkey is very central to that, but Turkey is hugely against the involvement of the Kurdish militia in Syria because it sees that militia as linked to its own Kurdish militants here in Turkey, the PKK, who Turkey and the West classify as a terrorist organisation. So Turkey wants assurances from the US that they might lessen their support for the Kurdish militia in Syria, although I think they're probably unlikely to get that assurance. They'll also discuss the creation of so-called safe zones in Syria, cleared of armed groups for refugees perhaps to go back to. Turkey's long called for that, and Donald Trump has voiced support for it in recent days, although Russia is more lukewarm. And Turkey will also push Mike Pompeo on the issue of Fethullah Gulen. He is the Turkish cleric who's been living in the US for 18 years and who Turkey claims orchestrated the failed coup last year, although he denies involvement. Turkey wants his extradition back here as soon as possible. They'll have to go through the judicial process, of course. This is very much a bridge-building exercise with the new Trump White House after relations with Barack Obama really soured considerably. And it will be helped, Simon, by some similarities between Presidents Erdogan and Trump. Both are populist leaders, both are not particularly known for their thick skins, and both have a fairly dubious relationship with press freedom, although, of course, it's much more extreme here in Turkey, which is the world's biggest jailer of journalists. So this is a visit very much which will be of substance, but also of symbolism as well, as Turkey attempts a reset with the new Trump White House.
Mark Lowen, thank you very much. It's come up to 1:20, our top story this lunchtime. Figures for December show A&E departments in England had their worst performing month on record, and January may be worse still. Coming up, try time. Tom Vondell runs in his 90th, leaving just one more score needed for the Premiership record.
And on Saturday with me at 1:30, bigger class sizes or lesson cutbacks. Head teachers in Oxfordshire say they're running out of ways to save money. And when Rodney met Dottie, the Portsmouth shark, looking for love in time for Valentine's Day.
MPs and housing lawyers say private tenants in England are still being unfairly evicted because of a new law on so-called revenge evictions, which isn't working. The law was introduced in 2015 to stop people who've complained about rogue landlords or their properties being wrongly forced out of their homes. Radio 1's Newsbeat reporter Dan Whitworth has more.
Damp, mould, faulty electrics and broken windows and boilers that don't get fixed when it's cold. They're all classed as Category 1 hazards. In other words, they're so bad, they pose a risk to people's health.
Hello?
And they're things Amjid Chowdhury from Leeds City Council's Rogue Landlords Unit is all too familiar with.
What is that? That's all damp that's been leaking from outside the guttering that we showed.
You might expect tenants to complain about problems like these, but many don't. That's partly because they fear being forced out of their home as a result, a practice known as revenge eviction, something which is supposed to be illegal.
This is rented out as private rented accommodation, people living here.
That's right.
People paying to rent here, making complaints, nothing happening, and then they could be under the threat of a revenge eviction for making the complaints.
That's the reason why they're not coming forward to the council to make a complaint.
And that's exactly what happened to Helen. She was living with her mum, sister and baby daughter in a rented home with lots of problems, including damp.
It was horrible. After months of complaining, we got a firm of solicitors in who deal with properties in these states of disrepair. They checked the property, they agreed that it was damp and something needed to be done. So they wrote out to our landlord and instructed that work needed to be done on the property. And within a week of him receiving that, we received a Section 21 eviction notice pushed under our door.
Because of what happened to people like Helen, a new law was introduced in October 2015 to try to stop retaliatory or so-called revenge evictions. But we've seen exclusive figures gathered in a Freedom of Information request from hundreds of councils right across England that show more than half haven't stopped any at all. More than a quarter don't even record figures, and fewer than 1 in 5 have taken any action.
We're talking about here landlords who are trying to avoid carrying out their responsibilities as landlords to keep their properties in a good state of repair. And if they're asked a simple question like, will you do a repair for me? They threaten someone with an eviction to shut them up. Now, they're the landlords we've got to get at, and they're going to be in the worst properties, sometimes with people living in the worst conditions. So that's the biggest challenge for everybody.
The government says revenge evictions are rare and that because of the new law, it's given local councils all the powers they need to stop them. Thankfully for Helen, she was able to find a new home.
My landlord's great. I can't complain about him, you know, so I don't have to contact him unless something does pop up.
But not everyone is so lucky. Dan Whitworth, BBC News.
4 men who were part of a gang that sexually exploited teenage girls in Rochdale are facing deportation to Pakistan. The men, who are British nationals of Pakistani origin, were jailed for between 6 and 22 years. Immigration judges have rejected appeals against plans to strip them of their British citizenship. MPs will put pressure on the FA today as they consider a no-confidence motion on the organisation's ability to reform itself. The Commons Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee will examine whether the FA can comply fully with its duties. Well, let's speak to our sports correspondent Richard Conway in Westminster. What are the consequences if they find against the FA board?
Well, this debate today, Simon, is largely symbolic, but it is a sign of the pressure that MPs are putting on the Football Association to change their ways. This debate about FA governance has been going on for nearly 50 years now, and there's been very little change in the interim. MPs want to see the FA change its board of directors and its FA council, which is effectively football's parliament. It wants it to be more representative of the people who play, watch and administer the sport in 2017. If they fail to reform, if they fail to live up to new standards which were set by Sport England and the government late last year, then they could be at risk of losing £30 million of public funding over the next 4 years. In addition to that, guarantees if they ever wanted to stage a World Cup or a European Championship could be at risk. So there is tangible things at risk here for the FA. The FA's leadership, well, it wants change to take place. It wants to modernise, but it must convince those councillors and those board members that it is in the interests of the FA as a governing body to do so. Greg Clark, the FA chairman, says he'll resign if he doesn't get the necessary support in the coming months. So this debate today, again, a sign of that pressure, but the FA determined in the coming few weeks it will show that it can change and show the government that it has a plan to modernise the organisation.
Richard Conway, thank you very much. Shares in Twitter have plummeted as the company reported its slowest quarterly revenue growth since going public. The company continues to grapple with competition from newer services such as Snapchat and Instagram. Well, our technology correspondent Rory Catherine-Jones is here with me now. Weren't the figures expect to be a lot better than that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Twitter's been going through a hard time for quite a while. The basic problem being it's not growing much, and investors have been worried about that. But there was the thought that with all the buzz around the US presidential election, all the rows taking place on Twitter, and the key fact that the most famous tweeter in the world, Donald Trump, was bringing a lot of focus on the service, there was an opinion, there was a theory that that would bring users flooding in, new users flooding in, and key to Twitter's future, more advertisers to give the service a secure future. That's not happening. There's very little sign in these figures of an acceleration in growth, and advertisers seem to be staying clear. They may be very interested in hearing what Donald Trump's going to say, but they're not spending money on advertising on the service.
Rory, thank you very much. An Australian man has survived after spending hours struggling to keep his nose above water after his digger toppled into a dam. Daniel Miller had been using the excavator at his remote farm north of Sydney when the rim gave way and he was pinned down by the 3-ton machine. He said he adopted a yoga pose and spent the whole time thinking about his wife and 2 young children until a neighbour heard his shouts.
Went to a very rational place, thought, I can just give up. There's no way, I'm not letting my daughter. I must think about how they're going to find me face down in a dam, dead. That wasn't going to happen. Well, not without a fight. So then I went to a very almost robotic state of just count to 60. Hold yourself. Don't think about 6 hours. Think about 60 seconds. Think about 60 seconds.
Remarkable, Daniel Miller. Now, as Wales and England prepare to go head-to-head in the Six Nations on Saturday, one player who's not playing on the biggest stage could be about to break the Premiership's all-time try-scoring record. Bristol winger Tom Varndell needs just one more try to pass Mark Cueto's record of 90 Premiership tries and could do it when his side face Harlequins tomorrow night, as Patrick Geary reports.
There aren't many who can keep up with Tom Varndell, one of the fastest rugby players around. You usually have to wait for the replays to catch him. With Leicester, Wasps and Bristol, he's turned pace into points. So many that one more try would take him to the Premiership record.
Obviously scoring tries is what I love to do. That's my job in the team, especially being the winger on the end of most of the moves, and any player wants to leave their mark on the game. And if I can do that with my try scoring, then that'd be fantastic.
He's been trying for some time. Varndell's played 12 seasons at English rugby's highest level. In that time, he's appeared in 176 Premiership games and run in 90 tries, a figure that puts him level with Mark Cueto, that master try scorer for Sale Sharks and England, a man who knows the miles which go into every finish.
His biggest asset is his speed. You know, he's lightning quick. He was always one of the fastest guys in the Prem, and from an athletic point of view, there isn't anyone better out there than him, and that's credit to him. I think he's creeping into his 30s now, so to still keep in the shape that he's in, he's doing really well.
There is, though, a difference between the two men. Cueto played 55 times for his country, Varndell just 4, despite a flying start.
Dream debut for Tom Varndell at 20. He is an England try scorer.
England represents a Varndell rarity, a chance missed.
I would have loved to have more opportunity. I would love to give a bit more of a shot, I think. What I like about the England setup at the moment is they are giving young boys a chance. They're sticking with them, they're developing them, they're allowing them to build into the international game and play to their strengths. England definitely focus on what players can do now rather than what they can't do.
If you play wing, there's no time for looking back as he prepares to go full throttle into his next shot at the record against Harlequins on Friday. Varndell's signed a new contract with Bristol. A career played out in fast forward is set to carry on running. Patrick Geary, BBC News in Bristol.
Now, say there was a weather presenter who was going to Cardiff on Saturday. I wouldn't ask her what colour she was going to wear, but I would ask her if she was going to dress warmly. Helen Willett.
you would be correct in saying that I'm very lucky to be going. And also, I will be wrapped up warm, Simon, because this cold weather is with us to last. Now, let me show you a wonderful picture, again, from Wales to start with. This was Neath, Port Talbot, this morning. Isn't that beautiful? Perfectly still, fantastic reflection. The frost there means, of course, enjoying some sunshine. That's not the case for all parts of the UK. This is more like the picture across the UK at the moment, Sunderland. You saw the Virga in the distance. That's the rain coming down, because look at the extent of the cloud on our satellite picture. The difference today is that yesterday in West Wales it was 11. Today the cold air has arrived across the western side of the UK. It's currently 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, but there's some sunshine. We've got a few showers close to the Cornwall coast, but they are more likely to be across the eastern side of the UK. Again today, there was a little bit of sleetiness on my car windscreen as I came in this morning. It is a little bit wintry out there. It's cold enough, and even at lower levels across parts of Scotland, that's the case. But northwest Scotland seeing some good sunshine. Northern Ireland much cloudier this afternoon compared with yesterday. Very little changes overnight. We keep all the cloud, but it still gets cold. And there's a greater chance of some of those wintry showers falling at lower levels and pushing a little bit further west. So with temperatures at freezing or around freezing, certainly an ice worry on untreated roads and pavements come the morning rush on Friday. Again, Friday, spot the difference really. It's the west the best for sunshine again. The east, again, rather grey with some showers. And yes, it's cold enough for those to fall as sleet or snow. Potentially even at lower levels as the day goes on, because we're importing colder air all the time. Just 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Again, I can't offer you anything higher than that, unfortunately, and not either for the foreseeable future, because we keep those easterly winds through tomorrow night and Saturday. Slight difference tomorrow night. Look at this weather system. It might push something a little bit more organised in the way of sleet and snow further west. So don't be surprised to see a light covering of snow on Saturday morning. If you're heading westwards as well, though, it should be dry for the match in Cardiff, but it will be cold, and especially so because of that strengthening easterly wind. And that will be with us, particularly for England and Wales, actually, on Saturday. Scotland and Northern Ireland faring a little better. If there is a little sunshine, it won't feel quite so bitter because you haven't the wind. And it's a very similar situation on Sunday as well. We've got a lot of cloud throughout the weekend. Temperatures perhaps marginally higher, 5s, 6s. But again, it's going to feel cold because of that wind, really. Now, there's a subtle difference later Sunday into Monday. Instead of the easterly, we're starting to pick up a slight southeasterly, so there's a bit of a Mediterranean influence. It won't be warm. It will just be slightly less cold. But the centre of that high pressure in Scotland, with no winds, there will be some fairly severe frosts as we head into next week as well. So frosty by night, cold by day, a lot of cloud and some wintry showers. As ever, when there are warnings issued, they'll be on the website. But cold, in a word, Simon.
Helen, thank you very much. Helen Willits. A reminder of our main story this lunchtime. Figures for December show A and E departments in England had their worst performing month on record, and January may be worse still. That's all from the BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from us. And on BBC One, we now join the BBC's news teams where you are from me. Good afternoon.